Today on Stronger Than Reason, we get our techno on with 808 State's third album, Excel. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. You know, I have to say I'm often torn doing this show. I know that for whatever reason, my ministry-related content seems to get the most love on here, along with Skinny Puppy and KMFDM as close seconds. So part of me is tempted to just burn through my Al Jorgensen collection to get as many eyeballs as possible. But you know what? I'm not going to do that. That's a trap. There's really no point in me doing this show if all I'm doing is chasing upvotes. And, you know, in theory, even if I did that, it would never grow the audience. So I'm not going to do it. The only way this show works is if I'm really following my interests at the moment. I have to be feeling it. Otherwise, it isn't fun. It's work. And let's face it, I have plenty of work as it is. This show has to be about me having fun and pretending I'm carefree and 18 again. I don't want to make it a drag or an obligation because I'll just burn out, and I don't want to do that. So despite this show's premise, I do listen to a lot of different kinds of music. I want to talk about music that interests me in the moment while I'm interested. And right now, that's pointing to a different sort of band. So I'm remembering a time back in 1991. I had just turned 18. I was finally an adult. And if I remember my U.S. history correctly, I was mostly concerned around this period about having to register for selective service. And I was wondering what consequences might come of that, you know, given that my country had just kicked off a big military operation in the Middle East. Now, you might know that that conflict didn't last a very long time at all, unless you count the 20 years we spent fighting in Afghanistan as a direct result. But who counts that? Because that was under a different Bush, after all. But at the time, it really wasn't so clear that my friends and I wouldn't be affected by the Gulf War. And it had only been 20 years since the Vietnam draft, and it really didn't seem like that long ago. And it certainly didn't seem like the United States really learned its lessons about that sort of conflict. And it seemed like periodic war was just the state of things throughout the 20th century. So it kind of made sense at that point that, you know, we were going to get dragged into another war sooner or later. But as it turned out, the peace did last for a time, at least until we had another Republican in the White House. But I was once again free to venture out to the mall to buy more music, and that's what I did. In fact, you know, I went to the mall and I happened to see a new release by a band that I had once heard of, a band with a pretty funny name. They were called 808 State, and of course they took their name from the classic Roland TR-808 drum machine, the drum machine that single-handedly launched 80s electronic music and hip-hop. And also, maybe less intentionally, they might have taken their name as a reference to Hawaii, which is the U.S. state that is, of course, in the Pacific Ocean, and which has the telephone area code 808. So there you go, a bit of United States trivia. Anyway, my friend had an earlier CD of theirs, and he made a mixtape for me that had two of their tracks on it. And one was this thing called Pacific that I liked a lot. It was a techno song, but it was immediately recognizable for two things. One, it had these distinctive bird call samples, and two, it just had this amazing soprano sax solo. Now, hold up, I hear you saying, soprano sax? I thought Stronger Than Reason rolled hard with only the most alternative electronic and industrial music. And now we're talking soprano sax? What are you going to review next, Kenny G? Yeah, so that's right. I do love the sax on this song, and I say that as a guy who once held a job as a busboy at a restaurant where they only ever played that one Kenny G album, you know, the one that was super popular in 92 or whatever. And you might remember the title, but I don't. I've burnt that part of my brain completely out, and I'll be damned if I'm even going to search for it. It still gives me hives to this day. So yeah, I have every right to hate on sax music in general just from that experience, but I don't. And the fact is, I love the sound of all woodwinds. I'm a friend to all woodwinds, and I particularly love to listen to the bass clarinet. And if you haven't already, check out Bitches Brew by Miles Davis and listen for Benny Maupin on the bass clarinet. He's magic on there. He's like Miles' secret weapon. But, the sax is great to listen to as well. I love a good saxophone. And Pacific would, of course, become 808 State's signature tune. And with that sax solo, it would kind of become a baggy Baker Street. And that's baggy with a capital B. But anyway, I liked it well enough. To me, it conjured up images of sunny beaches and sand, and it was upbeat and positive, which was just the opposite of most music I was listening to around this time. And it had a completely different vibe, one that was conducive to relaxing, or as we used to say, chilling out. The other track on my mixtape was this thing called 808080808, which is a lot of fun to say. I recommend you try it. It wasn't as distinct as Pacific, but, it didn't have any sax on it for one thing. But it was a cool techno song anyway, and together those two tunes made me pretty curious about this band. So you have to go back and imagine me in the mall that evening, shortly after turning 18, and registering for the draft and looking for some kind of distraction from the very hard realities of growing up and leaving home. And if I recall, I was even at the big mall in the big city. I wasn't at my local crappy National Record Mart. And lo, I see a new album for sale by 808 State. None of my friends had it yet. So I had an unusual first crack at the good stuff, and you can bet I snapped it up right away and glowed it all the way home. And the album, of course, was this. It was Excel. Now, I have to say that a part of what attracted me to this album, apart from the band name and the fact that I kind of knew the band, is just the cover art. This is just excellent graphic design. The 808 part of their name just really lends itself to a cool design, much like the 242 and front 242. So this cover spoke to me. It said, here's a band that's modern. They're into technology. They're almost certainly making music with beats and samples. They care about the presentation. They have the right style. And I've said it many times on this show, and I'll say it again. You absolutely can and should judge a book by its cover. And in this case, the cover tells you everything you need to know. This album could have been by any band, and with this cover, I would have given it a closer look. The fact that it was by a band I'd heard of, a band with a couple of tracks I knew and liked, that just sealed the deal. And as it turned out, nothing on this record disappointed me in the least. The music wasn't just generic techno. This is a record that's packed with musical ideas, and in fact, this was a band struggling with transitioning from being a dance band to a pop band. And this record kind of catches them at that moment when the butterfly wings are just starting to come out of the cocoon. And I gotta say, listening to it for the first time was a delight. And, let's talk about that first listen. I'd say that going into this album, I was cautiously optimistic because, I heard those two tracks on my mixtape a lot. And I'd heard their previous album, which in my country, the United States, was this. It was UTD State 90. My friend had this album. I didn't have a copy of this one at the time because, frankly, it didn't quite stand up to muster, at least where I was at that point. And it seems crazy to say now because I obviously own this album and I obviously love it. It's a seminal album from that whole Manchester scene at the time. And I have a much better context for it now. But back then, I didn't know any of that. All I knew was what I heard, and what I heard on this album wasn't as punchy or as exciting as the stuff I was hearing from Ministry and Skinny Puppy and Joy Division and all those other bands. It was just a little too happy, a little too blippy. It was sort of like early Depeche Mode. I can appreciate that now, and I can appreciate early Depeche Mode now, but I really couldn't then. I was really hungry back then for something more aggressive, maybe darker. So I pretty much figured Excel would be more of the same, that it was going to sound a lot like UTD State 90. So I was prepared for it to be pretty lightweight, maybe a couple cool throwaway dance tunes, and if nothing else, the cover looked really cool in my collection. So, I got this record home, and I did buy the cassette, first of all. I have the cassette somewhere in the scary archives. I'm not going to go in there. Very scary. But I put that thing on, and I listened to it. Then I put it on again, and I listened to it again. And then I played Excel for my friends, and we all listened to it over and over throughout that spring and summer. And it fell into our regular rotation. The music was recognizable as techno or house, whatever you want to call it, but it was definitely club music. But there was more there. There was a lot more going on. The arrangements were complex. Most of the songs were instrumentals or only had intermittent vocal samples, but they were still chock full of melodies, parts, and hooks. And, all of those component pieces were there competing for your attention. Usually, though, there'd be one part riding on everything else, just like a vocal normally would. And it turned out that for the most part, these songs didn't need a vocal. They were plenty interesting without that. The music changed up a lot. It wasn't repetitive. There were a ton of things going on. There was lots and lots of layering of sounds, not only of synth sounds, but everything. So the rhythms were interesting. It wasn't just four-on-the-floor house music. And also it didn't sound too preset-y. I mean, it didn't sound like they just turned their synths on and just recorded the first thing that came out. This was a band that was clearly doing their homework. They were doing a lot of sound design. And they weren't just throwing crap against the wall. The layers and parts all kind of made sense in the context of the song. Nothing on this album sounds like just a hot mess of stuff thrown together. It all sounds very meticulously crafted, as if someone went into writing each song with, specific ideas for voicings and parts. And there's not a lot of cliche here. So, for instance, you'll never hear the generic techno piano riffing that would be the bane of my existence just a few years later, when every band single would have to have at least 2 8-minute remixes that were nothing but that random beat and those stupid piano chords with nothing of the original track. So that is not happening on this record. But the other real eye-opener here were the 3 songs with actual vocalists. So there were 2 with vocals by Bjork, who at the time was known primarily as the lead vocalist for the Sugar Cubes, another band that I kind of like thanks to seeing their video for Hit on 120 Minutes. It was a really catchy song. And there was one song with vocals by Bernard Sumner of New Order. And that was a sweet bonus for me because I was a huge New Order fan at the time. And I got to say, it was super weird to hear him singing over another band. And little did I know that in just a few months, he would foist his first electronic album on the world. I'm sure I'll talk about that one in the not-too-distant future, speaking of albums that'll probably tank my ratings. But trust me, the best songs on that album still outweigh the worst. But these 3 songs on Excel, the ones with vocals, were all magnificent. And I can't say enough good things about them. In particular, Bjork's songs blew me away. I mean, I kind of knew what Barney could do already, but Bjork, to me, was a surprise. I didn't go very deep in the Sugar Cube, so I wasn't as familiar. And, this was before her solo career. So one of her songs on here in particular, which I'll get to, really is a mind bender. But my own reaction was one thing. Like I said, my friends pretty much all got into this album too, and that's really saying something since their tastes were all over the place. This album became another piece of our shared culture. It did hit a bit harder than UTD State 90. I thought the arrangements were even more varied, more complex, more satisfying. The vocal songs added that extra human touch. And, it wasn't spewing venom the way Ministry or Skinny Puppy did, but it was cool in a different kind of way. It just had a different vibe. And I gotta point out a little more context here that dance music in general was very popular around this time, around 1991. We had bands like EMF and Jesus Jones on the radio, and no one I knew was really into that popular stuff. We were all a little wary about dance bands that suddenly became popular. Remember back then, we weren't on the internet yet, so it wasn't easy to know where a band was coming from. And I remember the KLF got super popular around this time. They used to play 3 a.m. Eternal at high school dances. And to me, they were just another EMF. I mean, KLF, EMF, what's the difference, right? It was just more generic techno crap. And of course, I couldn't have been more wrong. If you check out my episode number 16 for more on why the KLF might have been the coolest band ever exist, you'll get the whole background there. But that's my point. It was hard to tell all of this on the ground in 1991. We were just inundated with new acts constantly, and we often didn't have the time or the money to separate the wheat from the chaff, and nor did we have the internet yet, which all but thinks for us these days. Ditto for the algorithms, most of which suck. I'm going to start printing t-shirts that say kill your algorithm. And I say that as a guy with a comp sci degree. So we have to ask, who were 808 State? And I'm not going to go very far into answering that because, frankly, I still don't really know. I mean, I know some names, but I don't know a lot about these guys. And they were all guys. Looking at the packaging for Excel, it's very hard to read all this stuff, but I see only a few names. They list Bjork Goodman's daughter and Bernard Sumner, of course, as the honored guests, but they don't list band members anywhere. And that's pretty strange, I thought. They usually have a big section on here that says, the band is this, and you learn all their names and who plays what. There's really only one other person listed on the back here as an engineer, and that person is named Graham Massey. And that's a name that I've heard associated with 808 State ever since back in the day in interviews and in articles and, Rolling Stone or whatever. Usually it's Graham Massey of 808 State or 808 State's Graham Massey. So if the band had a ringleader, I figured that was him. And I'm not just saying it because now I know he was a co-founder of the band and also the guy who played the sax parts in Pacific. I mean, really, after the sax performance, he didn't have to do anything else. He could just rest assured that he had made a solid impact on the world from that alone. But in fact, Graham is the sole member of 808 State these days, but we'll get to that in a bit. At the time of Excel, there were 3 other gents in the band. We had co-founder Martin Price, who was a bit older than Graham and who would leave after this album to start his own label. And I have to be really careful not to say Martin Prince, who is a character in The Simpsons. It's Martin Price. And we also had 2 DJs who were formerly known as the Spin Masters, Andy Barker and Darren Partington. I really know very little about those 3 guys, so I'm not going to get into their stories, other than to say I was actually quite saddened to hear that Andy Barker passed away on November 2021. And, all right, why would that make me sad? I didn't know the guy at all. In fact, I now just pretty much stated everything that I do know about him. And I guess it made me sad because he had to have been in his 50s, which is just way too young to go. And for another, I sort of thought of him as the face of the group. He was in most of the sleeve photos in Excel, and he had kind of a distinctive face. He just looked like a very young guy. Kind of looked like a younger Bernard Sumner, in fact. And I guess a part of me couldn't understand how he could be gone when he always looked like he was 15 years younger than everyone else in the band. I don't know, but it bummed me out. I do love the music that he helped create, and I did play some 808 State the day I heard of his passing. So in his honor, R.I.P. Andy. The other guy I have to mention here, even though he wasn't on this album, was the band's 3rd co-founder, a guy called Gerald Simpson, in fact. Of course, he left after their first album, New Build, to start a solo career as a guy called Gerald. That was the name of the act, and he would go on to have a tremendous club hit with his song Voodoo Ray, and just an amazing career in general. He's still out there doing it. Check him out. But yeah, he wasn't on Excel. So speaking of Mr. Sumner, and I don't mean Sting, I mean Barney, I soon learned that it wasn't so weird that he was on this album because it turned out that the band members were all from Manchester and would regularly play at the Hacienda and were otherwise pals with New Order. They were just another part of the whole Manchester scene at the time. And, personally, I was happy to learn that 808 State had connections to music I already love because I'm the kind of guy who usually has to have some kind of connection to pick something up. Whether it's an album, a book, a movie, or whatever, there has to be some connection to something I know. I'm not much of a browser. So once I figured these things out, Excel just seemed to fit into my collection like a puzzle piece, and it just made sense that I had it. So let's look at the album in a little more detail. But before we get to the track by track, I want to point out, I know there's always one more thing. I want to point out another thing on this sleeve that used to fascinate me, and that's this list of equipment here. And it's written in the tiniest print imaginable, but I'm just going to read some of this, and I'm just going to read it off. It says the Akai S1000, Alesis HR16, AMEC Mozart Desk and Software, ARP Axe, Atari 1040, running Hybrid Arts SMTPE, track bit 99, bit 1, case FZ1, Casio, MIDI guitar, Gibson Les Paul Deluxe, and it goes on and on like that. So it's listing all the gear that they use to create this album. And I don't know what half that stuff was, and I still don't, and I don't really care. I was just thoroughly impressed with all the brand names and model numbers. And, in thinking about this episode and thinking about this album, I actually did go in a couple days ago and Google some of this stuff and see what it actually was. What were these things and what did they look like? And it just struck me that for the most part, all of this gear was pretty damn primitive. I mean, of course, from today's perspective, what isn't primitive about 1991? But, I've checked out some interviews with Graham Massey. I've watched some live 808 State performances, and I think I kind of worked out their general method. For one, they used that Atari computer to sync everything. So it was sending SMTPE signals to all the outboard equipment, synths and samplers. I guess they weren't using MIDI. I guess MIDI didn't have enough market penetration at that point, perhaps, to be something that everybody could use. I know for sure that Sasha of KMFDM was also syncing with SMTPE even into the mid-90s. So yeah, I'm guessing that's true. I don't know if they were using this computer just for sync or if it was also like triggering things, but I do know that in performing, they also ran around and triggered a bunch of stuff and switched up patterns and played things themselves. There's a great performance of the band doing Nimbus on YouTube that you have to check out. It's a good example of their approach to playing live. But it's clear that from that video that they were totally playing it live. In interviews, Graham described the process of writing they wrote in terms of loops, according to Graham. So the music software of the day didn't have much in the way of timeline editing back then. So what they would do is just compose a few loops that seemed to work together, and that would form a song section. And then they would do that a few times so the song would have several sections. And then they would also write hand-played parts that kind of floated over atop both of those, like different sections or the different parts. And then they would come up with an arrangement and perform it all together by switching all the loops as best they could on the fly. And to be honest, it sounded like a lot of fun. More fun than performing electronic music these days, which, largely consists of pressing play and nodding along. At least there was some challenge to it, back in the day. But yeah, take a magnifying glass and check out the equipment list or look at it on Discogs. It's fascinating. And it's funny, too, because as a kid in 1991, I had no idea what any of this gear was. I wouldn't even see a real live DX7 for many more years. I didn't have any real musical gear. We did have a band of sorts in high school, which is a whole other story that I'd like to tell at some point. But we didn't have any gear. And how do you have a band without any gear? Well, you figure things out. And I wanted a synth because all the bands I really loved had synths, right? So my solution was to go to Service Merchandise and take my Christmas money and buy a big Casio keyboard, the kind with the pre-programmed rhythms and just a handful of these crappily sampled instruments. And it was pretty terrible. I mean, I didn't even know what it was that made a keyboard a synthesizer because I didn't know what synthesis was. And, I have to give myself a break. I was very young. I had no idea how to learn any of this stuff. I had no one to learn from. And I would eventually get my head on straight about all of that. And Lord knows I'd go on to buy and sell my share of gear over the years and probably someone else's share too. But this equipment list on Excel was the first time I remembered having any kind of insight into how electronic bands of the day actually made music. And it really fired my imagination, especially when I got a little older and had a job where I could afford such things. But, it wasn't long before the technology started to change, and it eventually you could do all this just with a computer. But in 1991, that was still about a decade and a half away. The other thing that I think is interesting about this sleeve is the fact that the band were signed to Zang Tum Tum, or ZTT, who, of course, were the label run by Trevor Horn and Paul Morley of The Art of Noise. And I talked about them extensively in my episode about The Art of Noise. And, they were a London label, and I can just imagine Rob Gretton and Tony Wilson being absolutely disgusted that such a prominent Manchester band as 808 State would sign with a label out of London. Oh, traitors. And I have to wonder why 808 State didn't go with Factory Records. Maybe because they had more than an ounce of business sense, or maybe because they actually wanted to get paid. I don't Either of those things could have been true. It's hard to say. I do know that they did play at the Hacienda, and I know for sure they were friendly with the Factory gang. Maybe it was just the DJ and techno scene was just a different world. I don't know. I think Factory was mostly focused on rock after all, or at least, bands that were doing their best to sound exactly like New Order, which 808 State, let's face it, they were not. So one last point before we get to the track by track. I just want to point out that, like I said, I first bought this album on cassette. A friend of mine bought it on CD soon after, and I was outraged to see that the CD had an extra track, Olympic. So again, folks, there was an incentive in the early 90s to buy CDs because you often got more music, and really made me mad because Olympic is a cool song. I just was annoyed at not having it on my cassette. I think that might have been what led me to eventually pony up for the CD. And of course, they came out with a new version of this album, I think in 2008, with a whole second CD full of even more songs that I'd never heard before. So definitely check that out. Anyway, so on to the songs here. I know this is really difficult to see because they use this tiny fly speck font, but that's where we are. Things start out with this song called San Francisco. And right away, I have to give props to the band for cool and creative song and album titles. They definitely have their own style. This is a pretty straight-up pop tune, mostly instrumental with just some vocal samples. The distinctive element here is this kind of recurring high-pitched whistle. But it changes up a lot. It keeps moving along. It's a solid intro. It gets your ass moving. Another thing I like about this album is how most of the tracks segue into one another. So it really does feel like an album. It feels like a single piece the way it all flows together. And as San Francisco is winding down, we slide into the beats for the next track, which is Spanish Heart. This is more down-tempo with lots of what sounds like marimba and bells. And I have to say it's one of my favorites here. This is the one with Barney Sumner on vocals. And if you think about it, this was just as New Order were going on hiatus after the Technique tour. So if you listen to my episode about Technique, you'll know that was my favorite New Order album. So on this album, Barney's powers here are near peak, right? His vocals and lyrics are top shelf. He's still on his game. And this being Barney, his lyrics are pretty abstract. He never really sings about anything concrete. But the backing track, the vocals work really well together. 808 State probably could have made a whole career just as a backing band for hire because they are awesome. If I had to sum up this song in one word, it would be classy. Spanish Heart just sounds classy, like something you'd hear late at night in a piano bar in Tokyo. It's just a cool song. Then we go into track 3, which is Leo Leo. This is more of a straight-up banger with an unusual rhythm. It samples some female backing vocals. The title comes from another vocal sample of a guy saying, "Make it strong like a lion." It's just a fun song that just changes up a lot. Then it's into what I think is maybe the most interesting song here, in my opinion. Track 4 is Q-Mart, which I assume is a take on the old Kmart stores in the U.S., but I don't know. Did they have Kmart in England in 1991? I don't know. But this is another down-tempo piece that's just absolutely beautiful. What makes it extra special are Bjork's vocals. And the thing that's fascinating is that she's just making vocal sounds. She's not singing actual words. There are no lyrics to this song. But she sings it the whole way through with just tremendous feeling. And that's just not something that just anyone can do. That's a real talent there. That's just amazing. And I think the proper term for what she's doing is glossolalia, which is just a great word. She's kind of giving a combination of fake words and just kind of mouth noises, and it complements the music perfectly. I listened back to this album to prep for this show, and I gotta say that Q-Mart has been my earworm, and it's been a great few days. It's just an amazing song on several levels. It's amazing for what Bjork does in her performance, but also the music itself. So check it out if you haven't heard it. It was quite different from my understanding of Bjork with her work in the Sugar Cube. So it was really eye-opening. I just never heard anything like it before, and it's just amazing and made me realize that Bjork is just on a completely different level entirely as a singer and performer. So things stay at a kind of mid-tempo with the next song, which is Nefertiti. It has some louder moments, but I guess the most notable thing about this song is that it uses that sample that says, "We are the music makers. We are the dreamers of dreams," which would soon become an overused sample in dance music, and Aphex Twin on to everyone else. So yeah, that's on there. I think that was its first appearance on the scene. So then we round out side one, and yeah, I do still think of this album in terms of sides 1 and 2, with Lift, which is just a great little song. This is like a palate cleanser. It's just sort of upbeat, kind of happy song, hence the title, I guess. It's also one of the singles off this album, and it's just a great little pick-me-up. So then we go on to side 2 with Bjork's other tune, Oops. What can I say? This is just another masterpiece. She sings it in English this time, and again, the music fits the vocals perfectly. I understand that collaborating with 808 State on this album is what got her interested in house music. So when she left the Sugar Cubes and struck out on her own, this was the kind of music she wanted to make based on the experience with working with 808 State on this album. And it's just a cool story. I mean, that kind of set her up on at least the first part of her very amazing career. She's great in general. I have a ton of respect for her. I think she's a true artist and a true iconoclast. And she's concerned not just with the music, but with the entire package. And that's what a real artist does, right? It's cool that this album is part of her early history. I think both of her contributions here on this album are just amazing. So we go into track 8, Empire. I think this is a cool enough tune, and it's a good example of how 808 State would write top-line melodies that fulfilled the role of a vocalist. So this is effectively a pop song with a vocal melody, but with no vocal, if that makes sense. It has enough changes and melodies here to keep you interested. The other thing I noticed is that on these instrumental tracks, I really listen to all the music. It's easy to hear everything as opposed to a song with vocals, because as soon as there's a singer singing, 80% of my attention rivets to the singer and what they're saying and how they say it, and all of the rest of the music kind of floats into the background, which is sort of a disservice, and a shame, because the band puts a lot of effort into making the music too. This band makes it really easy to listen to instrumentals. They are rarely repetitive or boring. They're always a treat for the ears. So yeah, we're going to go on to track 9 here, which is the big single, In Your Face. Now, you can't imagine how happy I was to see this video on MTV back in the day. It was like a validation of sorts that 808 State were making it. I was happy that they were getting that sort of exposure. This song is pretty much a straight-up club banger. It's one of their more popular tracks. It's funny, but this track makes me think of a mixtape I once made for a long-ago friend. It had a lot of, dopey romantic songs or whatever on it. And for whatever reason, I threw In Your Face on at the end. I guess because there was only so much sappy music I could handle. And it's funny because I can't remember a single other song that I put on that mixtape. Just this one. And, in retrospect, it could be why we didn't last longer than 2 months. But yeah, 808 State maybe helped her dodge that bullet. Anyway, this is a fun song. But we're moving on now to track 10, which is The Mighty Cubic. Now, this tune had been knocking around for a while and was actually on UTD State 90 as track 6. This is an earlier form of Cubic, maybe not as good in my opinion. On Excel, they reworked it into just this crazy monster. And it was definitely one of my favorite songs on this album when I was growing up. I loved how they started the track with some wild guitar, electric guitar that led into a simple atmospheric pad, and then they built up the main hook just piece by piece over time before the drums finally just, boom, came crashing in. And this is maybe the most straightforward dance song here. It's mostly, 4/4 house jam with a steady kick, not much in the way of complexity, but it's powerful for that. Again, I say it over and over, simplicity is power. And this is the tune on the album that's just going to pin you to the floor. And I much prefer this version to the version on the earlier album. It's, maybe the only song here also that has anything like recognizable guitar on it. Next up is Lambrusco Cowboy, which is notable, I think, mostly for its screamed vocals. There's just no words, just screaming. So otherwise, this tune is just like all over the place. All kind of parts just float in and out. And one of the breakdowns sounds very similar to the breakdown in Depeche Mode's Something to Do. I don't know if that was in fact taken from that or if it was just a coincidence. Probably just a coincidence. But I do love the energy of this song. It's just pretty wild. That goes into track 12, Techno Bell, which is just a great title. Yeah, it's a play, obviously, on the Taco Bell fast food franchise, which, I suspect everyone in the world is familiar with. This tune's mostly percussion, though there is at least one part with a prominent melody. The other thing that sticks in my mind here is that cymbal crash that happens every 2 bars, like through the entire song. So that's an odd thing to remember, but it's what I remember for some reason. And finally, we have the bonus track, track 13, Olympic. I already talked about this. It's just a cool, upbeat tune. It's in the same mold as Lift. It's a great note to end the album on, though, of course, my cassette ended with Techno Bell. This song has a lot of cool melodies throughout. It has a very distinctive pattern of like percussive bells throughout, which makes the rhythm track a little unusual. It's just a neat song. And that's the album. 13 tracks on CD, 12 tracks on vinyl and cassette. I guess I didn't open up the sleeve. Let's take a look at the sleeve here. You just get like a bigger version of the graphics and some tiny itty-bitty photos here of the band performing back when it was still okay to perform with lasers, right? And that's it. And I think these stills came from the VHS video that they were giving at the time. And there's Andy Barker, R.I.P. See, he's in all these pictures for some reason. All these sleeve photos. But yeah, not much information here on the sleeve. Not much information on the disc. This was a band that liked, that element of mystery, I suppose, as many dance and electronic acts did at the time. So why do I love it? First and foremost, I think this is just a unique, cool album. It sounded like nothing else in my collection at the time, and even today it kind of fills a special niche. It doesn't even sound exactly like the other 808 State albums that I have. It's interesting techno music. Really, in my opinion, 808 State's music kind of borders on jazz. It definitely has jazz influences in the melodies, the chord choices, the changes, the voicings. I know that Graham Massey is a big fan of jazz, so I'm sure that that's having some influence on that. I'm not just making it up, right? But their music is interesting to me in the way that good jazz is interesting. It's very dynamic and creative music. It's the opposite of what you would normally think of when you think of dance music. This is the opposite of trance, for instance. So trance is all about repetition and minimalism and kind of hypnotizing yourself with the beat. There's very little repetition in an 808 State song, typically. The arrangements are more Baroque than minimalist, to the point where I almost get the impression that the mixes start off too dense, and it's up to Graham to kind of carve out the song from this big block of noise, like subtractive sculpture. And I don't know if that's really how it worked or not. But for sure, Andy and Darren were DJs, and they would probably have no problem layering in tons of ideas and elements. Maybe it was up to Graham to sort out the final arrangements and to kind of bring everything together. But yeah, this is always an interesting listen. Their later albums would be the same. It was never electronic music by the numbers. It was very creative, a lot more creative and thoughtful than what you normally got from these electronic dance acts. Second, though, this album is special to me because frankly, I found it first, you know. It was rare in my gang, who are all very smart and attentive, to find an album first. But that's what happened in this case, and I brought this music to my friends, so that was cool. I also love that it was quite different from everything else I was listening to at the time. It was very much of the moment. Like I said, dance music culture was reaching a peak in 91. And soon enough, grunge would come around and just kind of sweep it all away. All the baggy and Manchester leftovers, all those bands that were mashing up dance music and psychedelic rock, they would just get blown off the stage. And it was too bad, in my opinion. You know, I found grunge and 90s alternative rock in general to be a lot less interesting, a lot more akin to like my hated classic rock that I had to listen to on FM all the time. I preferred the crazy stylistic mashups of the late 80s and early 90s. And this album, Excel, captured 808 State at the peak of that wave before it came crashing down. And I do love some other bands of that period, but 808 State had a unique sound, and I believe they did what they did better than anyone else. And that's why I love this record. Where are they now? As I mentioned before, Graham Massey is the only remaining member of the band. Like I said, Gerald Simpson left before Excel came out and went on to a successful solo career as a guy called Gerald. Martin Price would leave after Excel to start a music label and do some production. And as far as I know, he doesn't perform music anymore. And he's certainly not a character on The Simpsons. Like I said, Andy Barker passed away in 2021. RIP. Finally, Darren Partington had some trouble with the law, let's say, and I have no idea where he is today or what he's doing. I know Graham has toured a bit, giving talks about 808 State's writing methods and production methods, a bit of behind-the-scenes stuff, which is fascinating, and you can check that out on YouTube. Who can say if he'll produce any more music as 808 State? I don't know. Time will tell. But there you have it, folks. Maybe our first foray into honest-to-gosh dance music. 808 State's landmark album, Excel. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason, either on YouTube, which is our spiritual home, or as an Apple or Spotify podcast. And if you like what you heard, please leave a review or comment. I like hearing what you have to say. Let me know what you think of this album. Maybe next time I'll talk about industrial music again, or maybe not. Or maybe I'll talk about Kenny G. I don't know. I'm going to do whatever my heart tells me to do, because that's how I roll in this show. Thank you as ever for listening, and until next time, stay strong.